When I was 8, my dad spent hours with anatomical dolls teaching me to remember how mom molested me during their custody battle. She got 8 years and killed herself in prison. Then, at 16, I overheard him drunkenly bragging to my uncle, "The stupid beach died," thinking her own kid hated her for something she never did. I trained him so well he'd pass a polygraph. I found her grave, just a number, in the intimacy offender field where she'd been rotting for 6 years, while I gave speeches to abuse survivors about my monster mother. When did you trust the completely wrong person? When my father helped me through my testimony that put my mom in prison, I thought he'd saved me from the worst thing I'd ever experienced. But in reality, my nightmare had just begun. It all started when I was 8 years old. During my parents' vicious divorce, he sat me down with anatomical dolls the night before court and said he was going to help me remember things I'd forgotten. When I said nothing bad happened with mom, he looked so disappointed. "Sometimes our minds protect us by forgetting scary things," he said gently. "But I need you to be brave." He spent hours asking careful questions until I could picture it clearly. Mom's hands lingering too long during baths, the way she'd make me promise not to tell, how uncomfortable it made me feel. By morning, the memories felt completely real. Dad held my hand in court while I testified, squeezing it when I got scared. Mom screamed that he'd coached me, but her wild accusations just made her look guilty. She got 8 years, and he got full custody and became my hero. We were building a pillow fort in my room when the call came 2 years later. Dad's face went white as he listened. Then he hung up and pulled me into his arms. "Your mom, she died," he whispered. "In prison. She hurt herself." He explained that she'd left a note saying, "I'm sorry," over and over, that guilty people sometimes can't live with what they've done. I felt relief mixed with something else I couldn't name. The woman who'd violated me was gone, but she was still my mother. Dad held me while I cried, promising me it was okay for me to have complicated feelings, and we'd get through this together. He spent thousands on therapy to help me process the trauma, and I joined survivor support groups, wrote essays about overcoming childhood trauma, and became an advocate for other victims. My mother's crime was my identity. Dad drove me to every therapy appointment, every speaking engagement, every support group meeting. He was the perfect father to a broken kid. Then one night when I was 16, everything changed. I'd been out with a friend but came home early, and my dad was home hanging out with my uncle. I heard them laughing in the garage as I approached, and then the words that made my heart stop. 8 years and the kid still believes his mom diddled him, Dad was slurring. The stupid tramp unalived herself over something that never even happened. Somehow I managed to get my phone out and start recording him. He said, "I trained him so well he'd pass a polygraph," he bragged. Guards found her hanging with his school photo in her hand. Stupid Beach died thinking her own kid hated her for something she never did. And the beauty is, he'll go to his grave believing she was a child lover. I recorded it all with shaking hands while my father described my mother's death like a victory. I found her grave the next day, just a number in a field where they bury intimacy offenders whose families won't claim them. No name, no flowers, no evidence she'd ever been loved. I collapsed on that unmarked plot, sobbing apologies to the mother I'd helped convict. She'd been rotting in this grave for 6 years while I'd told rooms full of actual survivors that my mother had been a monster, and I knew what they'd suffered. In reality, the only monster had been my father. I went to a friend's dad, a lawyer, and asked him what my options were. He said that if I came forward with the recording and told the truth now, I'd be charged with perjury and face serious prison time. So I tried confronting Dad with the recording, begging him to confess publicly so I could clear her name without going to prison. He listened to the whole thing, then smiled. "Why the hell would I go to prison to clear that Beach's name? You want it so badly? You go get locked up." He rolled his eyes. "Go ahead. Tell the world you lied about your dead mother molesting you. Tell all those survivors you've been speaking to that you made it up. They'll lock you up for perjury and still think she did it." I made sure of that. He was right. Who would buy that the teenage boy who'd spent 8 years in therapy, attended support groups, and advocated for other victims wasn't legit? "You know what the real beauty is?" he continued. "Even if you prove I coached you, even if they do believe you, you're the one who testified. You unalived her, not me. There was no way out, and he wasn't even done trapping me. He called my therapist reporting I was having false memories and needed immediate intervention. He told my school counselor I was experiencing a psychological crisis from the trauma of my childhood. He contacted the survivor groups I belonged to, warning them I might show up with dangerous delusions that could trigger other victims. He showed me videos from my childhood he'd edited to look incriminating, plus 8 years of documentation proving I'd lived as an abuse survivor. Try to clear her name and I'll release these," he said casually. "Everyone will think you're having a breakdown. They'll lock you up and she'll still be remembered as a child lover who unalived herself rather than face justice." That night, he made dinner like nothing had happened while I sat across from him, knowing my mother had died, believing I hated her. She'd spent her last moments apologizing for things she never did to the son who destroyed her with coached memories. The recording that could prove everything would only send me to prison while her real killer slept soundly down the hall. The father everyone thought had saved me from a monster he'd created with dolls and patient questions, and an 8-year-old who'd believed every word. The whole world was wrong about which of my parents was the devil, and there was nothing I could do about it. I stared at my plate, unable to eat, while Dad chatted about his day at work, like he hadn't just confessed to destroying 2 lives. My hands trembled as I pushed food around, remembering Mom's face in court, how she'd reached for me as they led her away. The anatomical dolls flashed in my mind, Dad's patient voice coaching me through each false detail until I believed them myself. After dinner, I escaped to my room and pulled out the recording again. His drunken confession played through my earbuds while I searched online for any legal loophole, any way to expose him without destroying myself. Every search led to the same conclusion: perjury charges, prison time, and a world that would never believe the truth anyway. The survivor groups I'd spoken to would feel betrayed. The other victims I'd comforted would think I'd mocked their real trauma. Dad knocked on my door around 10, entering without waiting for permission. He sat on my bed with that concerned father expression he'd perfected over the years. His hand reached out to ruffle my hair, and I forced myself not to flinch. He asked if I was okay, mentioned I'd seemed quiet at dinner. I mumbled something about school stress, and he nodded sympathetically. He reminded me about my therapy appointment tomorrow, said Dr. Kepnick was worried about me after their phone call. Then he squeezed my shoulder and left, closing the door softly softly behind him. I lay awake most of the night, planning and discarding ideas. Maybe I could leak the recording anonymously, but Dad would know it was me. Maybe I could find other victims of his manipulation, but who else would there be? He'd targeted his own family, used his own son as a weapon. The precision of it made me sick. The next morning, I tried acting normal at breakfast. Dad made pancakes, my favorite, and watched me eat every bite. He drove me to school, reminding me that Dr. Kepnick would pick me up for our session. The whole day passed in a blur of classes I couldn't focus on, friends whose normal problems seemed impossibly distant. Dr. Kepnick's office had always felt safe before. Now I sat on her couch knowing Dad had already poisoned her against me. She started gently, asking about any unusual thoughts or memories I'd been having. I stuck to safe topics, school stress, college applications, normal teenage stuff, but she kept circling back. Had Dad mentioned anything about false memories? Was I experiencing any confusion about my past? I realized then how thoroughly he'd trapped me. 8 years of documented therapy sessions, all supporting the lie. 8 years of my own words, my own tears, my own healing journey from trauma that never happened. Even my therapist, who'd helped me through everything, was now his tool. After the session, I asked to walk home instead of getting a ride. Dr. Kepnick hesitated but agreed, probably noting it in my file as avoidance behavior. The walk gave me time to think, to accept that conventional methods wouldn't work. Dad had built an impenetrable fortress of lies, and I was trapped inside it with him. At home, I found him in his study, working on his laptop. He glanced up when I entered, eyebrows raised in mild surprise. I closed the door behind me and sat across from his desk, trying to look defeated. I told him he'd won, that I'd thought about it and realized there was nothing I could do. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Satisfaction, maybe, or disappointment that the game was over so quickly. He leaned back in his chair, studying me. Then he said something about how this was for the best, how Mom's memory was better left alone. The casual cruelty of it made my stomach turn, but I nodded like I agreed. I even managed to thank him for protecting me all these years, the words tasting like poison. That night at dinner, he seemed more relaxed. He actually asked about my day, made jokes, acted like the father he'd pretended to be for 8 years. I played along, laughing at his stories, asking about his work. Inside, I was taking notes, watching for patterns, weaknesses, anything I could use. Over the next few days, I became the perfect son again. Attended therapy without complaint, participated in my support group, even gave a speech at a local community center about surviving childhood trauma. I wonder what's really going through this kid's mind right now, playing the perfect son while knowing such a dark truth. The way he's acting normal at breakfast and therapy sessions seems like such a heavy thing to carry. Makes me curious about how someone. Dad sat in the front row, proud and supportive, never knowing that every word I spoke was gathering evidence of what he'd done. I started recording everything, our conversations, his phone calls, even just him moving around the house. Hours of audio files hidden in encrypted folders, backed up to cloud services he didn't know I had. Most of it was useless, but sometimes he'd say something revealing, usually when he thought I wasn't around. One evening I heard him on the phone with my uncle, laughing about some shared memory. He mentioned the divorce, how ugly it had gotten, how Mom had tried to take everything. Then, almost casually, he added that coaching me had been easier than he'd expected, that kids that age would believe anything if you were patient enough. I saved that file in 3 different places. The real breakthrough came when I was cleaning out the garage, supposedly looking for camping gear. Behind old boxes, I found a filing cabinet I'd never noticed before. Inside were documents from the divorce, including Mom's frantic letters to her lawyer claiming Dad was manipulating me. Her words, written in increasingly desperate handwriting, described exactly what had happened. How Dad had canceled my playdates the week before testimony, kept me isolated, spent hours alone with me. There were also receipts. The anatomical dolls, purchased 2 days before that night. Books on child psychology and memory formation, bought months earlier. A paper trail of premeditation that he'd been too arrogant to destroy. I photographed everything, then carefully replaced each document exactly as I'd found it. Dad came home while I was still in the garage, and I quickly grabbed an old tent to justify being there. He helped me carry it inside, complaining good-naturedly about how much junk we'd accumulated. That night, I lay in bed piecing together my evidence. It wasn't enough for legal justice, not with the perjury risk, but maybe I didn't need the law. Maybe there were other kinds of justice, other ways to make him pay for what he'd done to Mom, to me, to the truth itself. I thought about Mom's unmarked grave, the number instead of a name, the field where they buried people society had thrown away. She'd died believing her own son hated her, had spent her last moments looking at my school photo and apologizing for crimes she'd never committed. The weight of that truth was suffocating, but I couldn't act rashly. Dad had spent years building his fortress of lies, and I'd need to be just as patient, just as careful, to tear it down. Every move had to be calculated, every word measured. He'd taught me well, after all. He'd shown me exactly how to destroy someone's life with nothing but patience and carefully crafted stories. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd created his own enemy, trained me in the very skills I'd need to fight him. All those years of therapy had taught me to analyze behavior, to understand motivation. The support groups had shown me how survivors think, how they process trauma and seek justice. Even the public speaking had given me confidence, the ability to tell a story that people would believe. I started small, testing boundaries, mentioned casually that I'd been thinking about Mom lately, wondering about her childhood, her family. Dad's jaw tightened, but he responded smoothly, reminding me that dwelling on the past wasn't healthy. I agreed, then asked if we had any old photos of her from before everything happened. He said he'd thrown them all away, that it had been too painful to keep reminders. Another lie, probably, but I nodded understandingly and dropped the subject, filing his reaction away for future reference. Days passed in this careful dance. I maintained my perfect son facade while secretly documenting everything, building my arsenal of evidence. I learned his routines, his habits, when he was most likely to let his guard down. Late evenings after a few drinks, early mornings before coffee, phone calls with my uncle when he thought I was at school. The challenge was fighting someone who knew me so well, who'd literally shaped my mind for 8 years. Every strategy I considered, he'd probably anticipate. Every move I made, he'd be watching for signs of rebellion. I had to be unpredictable while seeming entirely predictable. Had to plan my attack while appearing completely completely defeated. One thing became clear. I couldn't do this alone, but who could I trust? Who would believe me? And more importantly, who could help without putting themselves at risk? Dad had connections, influence, a sterling reputation as a devoted single father. Anyone who helped me would be painting a target on their back. Still, I had to try. The recording of his drunken confession burned in my mind, proof that could destroy him if only I could find a way to use it without destroying myself. There had to be someone, somewhere, who could help me navigate this impossible situation. As I sat in my room that night, surrounded by hidden evidence and careful plans, I realized something. Dad thought he'd won because he'd trapped me in his lie, but he'd also trapped himself. He couldn't expose me without exposing himself. He couldn't silence me permanently without raising questions. We were locked in this horrible dance together, predator and prey, except I was no longer sure which role belonged to whom. The game wasn't over. It had barely begun. The following morning brought an unexpected development. Dad announced over breakfast that we'd be visiting my grandmother, his mother, for her birthday weekend. I hadn't seen her in months, and the timing felt deliberate. He watched my reaction carefully as he explained we'd leave Friday afternoon and return Sunday evening. I maintained my defeated facade, nodding along as he detailed the plans. But inside, my mind raced. 3 days away from home meant 3 days away from my evidence, my recordings, my carefully hidden proof. He was isolating me, removing me from any resources I might use against him. Thursday evening, I watched him pack his suitcase with practiced efficiency. He hummed softly, seemingly relaxed, but I noticed how he kept glancing at me. Testing, always testing. I packed my own bag slowly, making sure to seem listless, broken. Let him think he'd won completely. The drive to grandmother's house took 4 hours. Dad filled the silence with casual conversation about school, college plans, safe topics that wouldn't trigger any dangerous thoughts. I responded appropriately, even managed to laugh at his jokes. All the while, I studied him, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel, the slight tension in his jaw when I mentioned looking forward to seeing grandmother. Grandmother lived in a small house surrounded by farmland. She greeted us warmly, pulling me into a hug that smelled of lavender and baked bread. Dad watched our interaction closely, and I realized this visit served multiple purposes. He was reinforcing his image as the devoted son and father, while also ensuring I had no opportunity to act against him. That first evening passed slowly. Grandmother had prepared my favorite dinner, and we sat around her kitchen table like a normal family. She asked about school, my friends, my plans for the future. Dad answered half the questions for me, smoothly steering conversation away from anything potentially problematic. I excused myself early, claiming tiredness from the drive. In the guest room, I lay awake analyzing every word, every gesture. Dad had brought me here for a reason beyond a simple birthday visit, but what? Saturday morning revealed his strategy. Grandmother mentioned almost casually that she'd been worried about me. Dad had told her I'd been having some difficulties, some confusion about the past. She patted my hand gently, assured me that sometimes our minds played tricks on us, especially after trauma. He'd recruited her. Without her even knowing it, he'd turned my grandmother into another guard in my prison. Her genuine concern for my well-being would make her report any unusual behavior directly to him. Another escape route closed. I spent the day helping grandmother in her garden, pulling weeds and planting flowers. The physical work gave me time to think. Dad lounged on the porch, seemingly relaxed, but always watching. Every time I looked up, his eyes were on me. That afternoon, while grandmother napped, Dad suggested we take a walk. We headed down the dirt road that ran past her property, dust kicking up under our feet. For several minutes, we walked in silence. Then he spoke. He talked about family, about loyalty, about the importance of protecting the people we love. His tone was conversational, almost philosophical, but I heard the warning underneath. He was reminding me that any action I took wouldn't just affect him. It would destroy grandmother's image of both of us. It would taint every family gathering, every holiday, every memory. We turned back as the sun began to set. Dad draped his arm around my shoulders, a gesture that looked affectionate but felt like a shackle. I didn't shrug it off. I couldn't afford to show any resistance, not yet. Sunday's drive home was quieter than the trip there. Dad seemed satisfied with the weekend's outcome. He'd successfully demonstrated how thoroughly he controlled my world. Every person I might turn to had been either recruited or warned away. Every avenue of escape had been blocked, but he'd also revealed something important. He was worried enough to take preventive action. Somewhere in his careful planning, he saw a threat. That meant I had power, even if I didn't yet know how to use it. Back home, I immediately checked my hidden evidence. Everything remained untouched, but I noticed subtle signs of searching. A folder slightly out of place. Dust disturbed on a shelf. He'd looked but hadn't found anything. My precautions had worked. The next few weeks fell into a tense routine. I attended school, therapy, support groups. The way he kept all those receipts from buying the dolls and psychology books is really strange. Why would someone save evidence of their own planning like that? I played the role of the recovering victim perfectly, but underneath, I was learning. Every interaction with Dad taught me more about his psychology, his fears, his weaknesses. I discovered he had patterns I'd never noticed before. He always checked his study door twice before important phone calls. He deleted his browsing history obsessively. He kept a bottle of whiskey hidden behind books in his office, one he thought I didn't know about. Dr. Kepnick grew increasingly concerned about my flat affect, as she called it. I gave her just enough emotion to seem engaged, but not enough to satisfy her. Let her report back to Dad that something was off. Let him wonder what I was planning. One evening, I overheard him on the phone with someone new. A woman's voice, though I couldn't make out her words. Dad's responses were careful, measured. He mentioned documentation, medical records, psychiatric evaluations. Was he building new defenses, or was this something else? The answer came the following week. Dad introduced me to Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in recovered memories and trauma-induced false recollections. She would be conducting an intensive evaluation to help me process my confusion about past events. Dr. Mosley was younger than Dr. Kepnick, with sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. Our first session was probing, but not aggressive. She asked about my recent thoughts, any dreams or flashbacks I'd experienced. I gave her the performance of my life, mixing truth with careful lies, showing just enough distress to seem genuine, but I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. She scheduled twice-weekly sessions, explaining that intensive therapy could help resolve my current crisis. Dad nodded approvingly, but I caught a flicker of something else in his expression. Uncertainty? Fear? Between sessions with Dr. Mosley, I intensified my surveillance of Dad. I learned he'd been making calls to old contacts from the divorce, lawyers and social workers who'd been involved in the original case. He was shoring up his defenses, preparing for a battle he insisted I couldn't win. One night, while he attended a work function, I searched his study more thoroughly than ever before. Hidden in a locked drawer I managed to pick, I found a file labeled with my name and birthdate. Inside were years of documentation, but not what I expected. There were psychological profiles of me at different ages, notes about my suggestibility, my eagerness to please, my fear of disappointment. He'd been studying me like a scientist studying a lab rat, documenting exactly how to manipulate me most effectively. One page made my blood run cold. It was dated a week before the divorce proceedings began, months before he'd supposedly discovered Mom's abuse. In his own handwriting, he'd outlined the entire plan, how he'd plant the memories, what details would be most believable, how he'd ensure my testimony would be unshakable. I photographed every page, my hands steady despite the rage building inside me. This was premeditation documented in his own hand, but it was also evidence of child abuse, psychological torture that would implicate me as much as him in any legal proceeding. The front door opened downstairs. I quickly replaced everything exactly as I'd found it, slipping out of the study just as Dad's footsteps reached the stairs. We passed in the hallway and he paused, studying my face. I mumbled something about getting water and continued to the kitchen. My heart hammered, but I kept my movements casual, normal. I heard him enter his study, heard the drawer open, a long pause, then it closed again. Dr. Mosley's sessions grew more intensive. She introduced techniques I recognized from research, methods designed to separate false memories from real ones. I navigated each carefully, maintaining my story while showing just enough doubt to keep her engaged. During one session, she mentioned speaking with Dad about my progress. Her expression was neutral, but something in her tone caught my attention. She wasn't entirely aligned with him. There were cracks in his control. I began planting seeds of doubt. Nothing dramatic, just small inconsistencies in Dad's behavior that she might notice. How he always insisted on driving me to appointments. How he needed detailed reports after each session. How he'd installed tracking apps on my phone for my safety. Meanwhile, Dad's behavior at home grew more erratic. He started working from home more often, keeping me under constant surveillance. He installed new locks on doors I'd never tried to open. He password-protected computers that had always been accessible. One evening, he sat me down for what he called a family meeting. He talked about trust, about healing, about moving forward together, but his eyes were cold, calculating. He was assessing me, trying to determine if I was still under control. I gave him what he wanted to see, nodded at the right moments, teared up when he mentioned Mom, thanked him for his patience and support. Inside, I was stone. I'd learned to separate my real self from the performance, to hide my true thoughts behind layers of expected behavior. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While organizing old school papers for a college application, I found a birthday card from Mom, one from before the divorce. Her handwriting was shaky, desperate, but it was the postmark that caught my attention. It was dated after she'd supposedly been arrested, during a time when Dad said she'd had no contact with me. I examined the card carefully. It had been opened, read, hidden away. Mom had tried to reach me even after her conviction, and Dad had intercepted her communications. How many letters had there been? How many attempts to connect that he'd blocked? This discovery led me to search more carefully through stored boxes in the attic. Hidden among old toys and school projects, I found a small cache of letters, all from Mom, all opened and hidden. Her words were careful, constrained by prison regulations, but full of love and confusion. In one letter, she mentioned a visitor, someone she thought Dad had sent to torment her. She described questions about her childhood, her relationship with her own parents, details that seemed designed to build a profile of a potential abuser. Dad hadn't just framed her, he'd tortured her psychologically in prison, reinforcing her guilt for crimes she hadn't committed. I photographed these too, adding them to my growing digital archive, but I was running out of time. Dad's paranoia was escalating. He'd started checking my room while I was at school, going through my belongings with increasing thoroughness. Dr. Mosley noticed the mounting tension. During our sessions, she probed deeper into my family dynamics, asking questions that seemed to extend beyond recovered memories. I sensed an opportunity, but had to be careful. One wrong word and Dad would remove her from the equation. I began describing dreams, vivid nightmares that mixed truth with fiction. In them, dolls became puppets, and I was both puppeteer and marionette. Dr. Mosley's interest sharpened. She asked for more details, encouraged me to explore the symbolism. Through these dream narratives, I painted a picture of manipulation and control that any trained psychologist would recognize. I never accused Dad directly, never contradicted my original testimony, but I laid out patterns of behavior that told their own story. The turning point came during a particularly intense session. Dr. Mosley asked about my earliest memory of feeling unsafe. Without planning it, I described the night with the anatomical dolls, but I told it differently this time, focusing on my confusion, my desire to please Dad, the way the story had changed with each telling until I believed it myself. She didn't react visibly, but I saw her making notes, saw the slight furrow in her brow. When the session ended, she asked if I'd be comfortable with her reviewing some of my early therapy records. I agreed eagerly, perhaps too eagerly. She noticed that too. That night, Dad was waiting when I got home. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me with those calculating eyes. Then he mentioned that Dr. Mosley had called, wanting to discuss my treatment plan. His tone was casual, but I heard the warning underneath. Dinner was tense. Dad talked about potentially switching therapists, finding someone who specialized in different techniques. I protested just enough to seem genuine, but not enough to raise suspicion. Let him think I was attached to Dr. Mosley. Let him wonder why. Over the next few days, I noticed increased scrutiny. Dad started accompanying me to more activities, showing up unexpectedly at school events. He was tightening the net, preparing for something. But what? The answer came in the form of a family dinner with my uncle. He arrived looking uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with me. As we ate, the conversation felt forced, full of hidden meanings I couldn't quite grasp. After dinner, Dad suggested I show my uncle my college application essays. It was an odd request, but I complied. As my uncle read through my carefully crafted words about overcoming trauma, I watched his face. He knew. Maybe not everything, but he knew something. When he left, he hugged me longer than usual, whispered something about being proud of me, about strength coming in many forms. Dad watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. That night, I lay awake piecing together the puzzle. Dad was building a case for something: the increased therapy, the family visits, the documentation. He was creating a paper trail that would support some new narrative, some new trap I hadn't yet recognized. The next morning brought clarity in the worst way. Over breakfast, Dad mentioned considering a treatment facility, a place that specialized in false memory syndrome, somewhere I could get intensive help for my confusion, somewhere isolated, controlled, where his version of reality would be the only one that mattered. I kept my expression neutral, asked appropriate questions about the program. Inside, panic clawed at my throat. Something doesn't add up about Dr. Chen suddenly becoming Dr. Mosley in the middle of these sessions. Makes me wonder if the narrator's keeping track of all these moving pieces, or if Dad's bringing in multiple specialists to test different angles. A treatment facility would mean no access to my evidence, no contact with anyone who might help. It would be the perfect prison, disguised as medical care. Time was running out. Whatever plan I'd been forming needed to accelerate, but every move I considered seemed to lead to the same trap: expose him and face prison myself, stay silent and disappear into a facility where my truth would be medicated into submission. Dr. Mosley became my only hope. During our next session, I took a calculated risk. I mentioned the treatment facility, watched her reaction carefully. She asked probing questions about the suggestion, about who had recommended it. Her concern seemed genuine. As the session ended, she did something unexpected. She handed me her business card, pointed to her personal cell number written on the back. "For emergencies," she said. Her eyes held mine a moment longer than necessary. I pocketed the card carefully, aware that Dad would search for it later. But I memorized the number first, burned it into my memory like a lifeline. Dr. Mosley knew something was wrong. Whether she'd help remained to be seen. The next few days were a careful ballet of surveillance and counter-surveillance. Dad watched me constantly, but I'd learned to hide in plain sight. I deleted my digital evidence cache, distributed copies across cloud services he didn't know existed. I prepared for the possibility that I might lose access to everything. During this time, I made another discovery. While helping with laundry, I found a receipt in Dad's pocket. It was from a private investigator, someone he'd hired recently. The pieces clicked into place. He wasn't just monitoring me, he was investigating someone else. But who? The answer came when I overheard another late-night phone call. Dad mentioned Dr. Mosley's name, her credentials, her history. He'd been investigating her, looking for leverage. And from his satisfied tone, he'd found something. I had to warn her, but how? Any direct contact would be monitored, traced, used against both of us. I needed a method that wouldn't implicate either of us, something that would seem like coincidence rather than communication. The solution came from an unexpected source. During my support group meeting, I shared a carefully crafted story about trust and betrayal, about the complexity of truth. I knew Dad would hear about it, but I also knew the group facilitator often consulted with other therapists about challenging cases. The story would make its way to Dr. Mosley, carrying my coded warning. Sure enough, Dad confronted me that night about my share at group. I played confused, insisted I'd been talking about my ongoing healing process. He seemed to buy it, but his agitation was visible. The walls were closing in on both of us. Dr. Mosley's next session was different. She was more careful, more formal, but she also asked new questions, ones that seemed designed to create an official record. She had me describe in detail my emotional state, my living situation, my relationship with Dad. She was building documentation of her own. As weeks passed, the tension in our house became unbearable. Dad barely slept, spending nights in his study making calls, sending emails, preparing for something. I maintained my facade during the day, but spent nights planning contingencies, preparing for whatever was coming. The treatment facility brochures appeared on the kitchen counter one morning. Glossy photos of peaceful grounds, smiling patients, caring staff. Dad discussed it casually over breakfast, mentioning he'd scheduled a tour for next week. Just to see, he said, just to explore options. I knew that tour would become an admission. Once I entered those gates, I might never leave, not as myself anyway. Whatever I was going to do, it had to happen before that tour. But Dad had anticipated even this. He took time off work, stayed home to monitor me constantly. He drove me to every appointment, waited outside every meeting. The prison was complete, and he was the only guard. Dr. Mosley managed to communicate through careful questions and meaningful looks. She was documenting everything, building a case file that might protect me. But we both knew it might not be enough. Dad's story was too well constructed, his reputation too solid. The night before the facility tour, I made my decision. Whatever happened, I wouldn't enter that place. I'd spent 8 years living a lie that destroyed my mother. I wouldn't spend the rest of my life in a place designed to reinforce that lie. I prepared carefully, knowing I'd have one chance. Everything I'd learned about Dad, every weakness I'd observed, every pattern I'd documented, it all came down to this. He'd taught me well, showed me how patient manipulation could destroy a life. Now I'd use those same tools against him. The morning of the tour arrived gray and drizzling. Dad was up early, preparing with unusual care. He wanted to make a good impression at the facility, present himself as the concerned father seeking help for his troubled son. I played my part, dressing neatly, acting subdued but cooperative. As we prepared to leave, I made my move. Not dramatically, not obviously, just a small action that would cascade into something larger. I'd learned from the master, after all. Sometimes the smallest push could topple the largest structure. The game that had begun with anatomical dolls and patient questions was about to reach its conclusion. One way or another, the truth would finally break free from the prison of lies we'd both helped build. The only question was which one of us would be left standing when it did. I slipped my phone into my pocket, the recording app already running. Dad noticed the movement but dismissed it as nervous fidgeting. He grabbed his keys and gestured toward the door, that practiced paternal smile never wavering. The drive to the facility stretched endlessly. Dad filled the silence with descriptions of their innovative treatment methods, their success rates with patients suffering from false memory syndrome. I nodded at appropriate intervals while mentally reviewing everything I'd learned about him, his need for control, his paranoia about exposure, his absolute certainty that he'd won. We arrived at a sprawling complex that looked more like a country club than a treatment center. The receptionist greeted Dad by name, confirming my suspicion that this tour was just a formality. My admission had already been arranged. The director, a woman with kind eyes and a firm handshake, led us through pristine hallways. She explained their intake process, the initial evaluation period, the restricted communication policy for the first month. Dad asked careful questions about security measures, about preventing harmful outside influences from disrupting treatment. I played my part perfectly, asking tentative questions about daily routines, recreational activities, anything that made me seem cooperative but apprehensive. Inside, I was counting down, waiting for the right moment. It came in the director's office. She excused herself to retrieve admission paperwork, leaving us alone. Dad relaxed slightly, his guard dropping for just a moment. He walked to the window, surveying the grounds with satisfaction. I pulled out my phone, fingers moving quickly across the screen, not to call for help or send evidence to authorities. Instead, I opened the email I'd prepared the night before, the one addressed to our entire extended family, Dad's colleagues, his church congregation, everyone in his carefully maintained social circle. The email contained no accusations, no dramatic revelations, just a simple message about my voluntary decision to enter treatment for false memory syndrome, along with a link to a private web page I'd created, password protected and set to activate in exactly 1 week. I hit send. Dad turned at the soft whoosh of the departing email. His eyes narrowed as he saw my phone, but I was already sliding it back into my pocket. He started to speak, then stopped. The director returned with a stack of forms. The next hour passed in a blur of signatures and explanations. Dad's phone buzzed repeatedly, but he couldn't check it without appearing rude. I watched him grow increasingly agitated, his responses to the director becoming shorter, more distracted. Finally, he excused himself to take an urgent call. Through the office window, I watched him pace the parking lot, phone pressed to his ear. His free hand gestured wildly as he spoke. The director continued explaining treatment protocols, unaware of the storm building outside. Dad returned, looking pale. He apologized to the director, explaining that a family emergency required immediate attention. We'd have to reschedule the admission. She expressed understanding, assured us the spot would remain available. The drive home was silent. Dad's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight I could hear his teeth grinding. I stared out the window, counting down in my head, 7 days. At home, Dad disappeared into his study. I heard him making call after call, his voice growing more strained with each conversation. By evening, he emerged looking haggard. He found me in the kitchen, making dinner as if nothing had changed. He demanded to know what I'd done. I explained calmly that I'd simply informed family about my upcoming treatment, asked for their support during this difficult time. His face darkened as I mentioned the webpage, the 1-week timer. I told him it contained my full story, every piece of evidence I'd collected, ready to be released to everyone he knew. Unless. The word hung between us like a blade. Dad waited, his breathing shallow. I continued preparing dinner, letting him stew in his own paranoia. Finally, I laid out my terms. He would write a full confession, detailing exactly what he'd done to Mom. He would have it notarized, witnessed, legally binding. He would place flowers on her grave, with her name properly displayed. He would pay for a headstone, a real one, acknowledging her innocence. How did he figure out the perfect timing for that email during the facility tour? The way he waited until the director left them alone shows such careful planning. And then he would leave, move across the country, start over somewhere else, cut all contact with me, with our family, with everyone who knew our story. In exchange, the webpage would never activate. His reputation would remain intact as long as he stayed gone. Dad laughed, harsh and bitter. He called my bluff, said I'd never risk exposing myself. I served dinner in silence, let him believe what he wanted. But I saw the doubt creeping in, the fear that maybe, just maybe, I'd reached a point where prison seemed preferable to living his lie. The next 3 days were a war of nerves. Dad tried everything. Threats about the facility, promises of a better relationship, attempts to access my phone and computer. I'd anticipated it all. My evidence was scattered across a dozen cloud services, protected by passwords he'd never guess. The webpage existed on servers in 3 different countries, paid for with cryptocurrency I'd carefully acquired. He tried to trace my digital footprints, even brought in a computer expert under the guise of upgrading our home network. I watched from my doorway as they found nothing. Every important file was encrypted, every crucial communication routed through proxies. I'd learned from the best, after all. He'd taught me the importance of covering my tracks. By day 4, the cracks were showing. Dad had stopped sleeping, stopped eating regular meals. He paced the house at all hours, muttering to himself. Family members had started calling, asking about my treatment, offering support. Each conversation drove him deeper into panic. He tried one last manipulation on day 5. Came to my room with tears in his eyes, talking about Mom, about how much he'd loved her despite everything, how the divorce had driven him crazy, made him do things he regretted, but it was too late to fix it now, wasn't it? Too late for confessions and apologies. I almost wavered, almost. Then I remembered Mom's letters from prison, her confusion and pain, her final moments believing her own son hated her. I told Dad he had 48 hours to decide. Day 6 brought unexpected visitors. Dr. Mosley arrived unannounced, claiming she needed to discuss my treatment plan. Dad couldn't refuse without raising suspicions. She interviewed me privately, asked careful questions about my decision to enter the facility. I gave measured responses, maintaining my cover while communicating through subtext. As she prepared to leave, she mentioned that my case had attracted interest from her colleagues. Several specialists wanted to review my files, particularly the early documentation from age 8. She'd need Dad's permission to share the records, of course. His face went gray at the implications. That night, I found Dad in his study, a half-empty whiskey bottle at his elbow. Legal documents covered his desk, the confession I'd demanded among them. He looked up as I entered, his eyes red-rimmed and defeated. He signed the papers without a word. I watched him initial each page, his hand trembling slightly. When he finished, I took the documents and locked them in my room. One more day. The final morning arrived bright and clear. Dad was gone before I woke, leaving only a note saying he'd gone to make arrangements. I spent the day in strange limbo, half expecting him to return with police or psychiatrists, some last desperate attempt to maintain control. Instead, he came home that evening with proof. Photos from Mom's grave, now adorned with fresh flowers and a temporary marker bearing her name. Receipts for a headstone order, her full name and the words beloved mother to be engraved in granite. His car was packed, boxes and suitcases filling the trunk and back seat. We stood in the driveway as dusk fell. Dad looked older somehow. somehow diminished. He started to speak several times, then stopped. Finally, he just nodded and got in his car. I watched him drive away, taillights disappearing around the corner. I went inside and disabled the web page, deleted the timer, removed all traces of its existence. The evidence would remain, hidden but secure, insurance against his return, but I wouldn't need it. Dad understood the price of his freedom. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with Mom's letters spread before me. I read each one again, hearing her voice in the carefully written words. Tomorrow, I would visit her grave, see her name finally displayed with dignity. I would tell her the truth, apologize for my part in her destruction, promise to live a life that honored her memory. The house felt different without Dad's presence. Lighter somehow, as if his lies had been a physical weight pressing down on everything. I had no idea what came next. College applications still waited, my future uncertain. The survivor groups I'd spoken to would never know the truth. The false identity I'd lived for 8 years would remain, a scar that would never fully heal. But I was free. Free from the daily performance, the constant vigilance, the suffocating weight of his control. Free to figure out who I really was beneath the lies. It wasn't justice, not really. Mom was still gone, her reputation forever tainted. I still carried the guilt of false testimony, the knowledge that my words had condemned her. Dr. Mosley called the next day, professionally informing me that the facility had contacted her about my canceled admission. She wondered if I'd like to continue our sessions, perhaps explore some of the issues we'd been discussing. I agreed, knowing she understood more than she could officially acknowledge. The weeks that followed were quiet. I established new routines, learned to navigate life without Dad's constant presence. Family members asked about him, and I explained he'd taken a job opportunity across the country. The story spread naturally, believed because people wanted to believe it. I graduated high school without fanfare, enrolled in a local community college, psychology major, to no one's surprise. Dr. Mosley continued our sessions, helping me process the trauma of both the false memories and the truth. Progress was slow, measured in small victories and difficult setbacks. 6 months later, I stood at Mom's grave with its new headstone. Fresh flowers replaced the wilted ones, a ritual I'd maintained weekly. I told her about my classes, about the part-time job I'd found, about the apartment I was saving to rent, normal things, the kind of updates she'd missed for 8 years. Sometimes I wondered where Dad was, what story he was telling in his new life. But mostly I focused on my own journey, the slow work of building an authentic existence from the wreckage of lies. It wasn't the dramatic ending anyone would expect. No public vindication, no legal justice, no moment of triumph, just a quiet victory measured in small freedoms. The freedom to think my own thoughts, to feel my own feelings, to remember my mother with love instead of manufactured horror. The freedom to choose my own path, even if that path was complicated by the past I couldn't change. I touched Mom's headstone one last time before leaving. The granite was warm from the afternoon sun, solid and real beneath my fingers. Her name carved deep and permanent, a truth that could no longer be hidden or denied. It wasn't enough, would never be enough, but it was what I could give her now, in this life shaped by lies, but no longer defined by them. The cemetery gate closed behind me with a soft click. I walked to my car, drove home to continue the quiet work of living. No dramatic finale, no perfect resolution, just the daily choice to move forward, carrying the weight of the past, but no longer controlled by it. Thanks for riding out all the twists and turns with me today. Definitely a lot to wonder about. Until next time, subscribe for more content like this.